One of the greatest reasons I stayed away from God and religion for most of my life was because I felt that becoming a follower of God, a religious person, would take away all of my freedom. Well, to a certain extent, I was not wrong. There are many man-made laws that really does just that. But once I had my own personal encounter with God, I realized that something was not adding it up. A God of love that supposedly create us to have abundant, happy life will not create oppressing laws. I decided to study a little about God's law. What I learned will surprise you, as it surprised me. Contrary to what many think, God's law brings us peace, not bondage. Those that will be saved are described in Revelation 14:12 as having the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. From these verses, we see that although we are not saved because we keep the commandments, but those that are saved do keep the law of God. I think the trick here is to understand what is God's law and what are man-made up traditions disguised as God's law. And are God's law oppressive? So let's study God's law. Before we get into that, we can actually break God's law in three parts, three categories. The first is God's moral law, also known as the Ten Commandments. As we study, we will see that those are eternal, those are for all generations, and they do not change. But the second category are ceremonial laws, also known as Moses' law. Those are the laws given by God to Moses as a guide for the people of Israel while they were in the desert. And part of these laws were valid all the way to the time of Christ, when he died on the cross. But it does not apply to us today. We will look into a little more details about these laws in a little bit. And the third category were the healthy laws, also given to Moses at the time they were in the desert, and their principle is still valid until today, but not always literally. For an example, there was a law that told people that when they would need to go number 2, they needed to go out with a shovel, make a hole. When their business was done, they needed to cover it. The principle, which is hygiene, is still valid until today, but we don't have to go outside with a shovel every time we need to go. Because today we have running water and flushable toilets. There are many more examples like this one in the Bible. So we have three categories: the moral law, which is eternal, the ceremonial law that was carved on the cross, and the healthy law that its principles is still valid. We will look in more details on the moral law found in Exodus 20 verses 2 through 17. The first law says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Here, God identifies himself to the people that have just spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt and needed a reintroduction to who their true God was. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt, and none of those other gods are real. The Egyptians worshipped everything. That is why God sent the 10 plagues the way that he did. Each plague was to destroy the faith they had in their gods. The second law says, "You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love kindness to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments." First, God is saying to do not worship anything, not even something that you might think it has my image or the likeness of heaven. God knows that by nature we have the tendency to worship things. Knowing how dangerous that is, he is warning us for our own protection. For whatever we worship, we become. Second, I like to point out that I prefer the translation for the Hebrew word jealous to zealous. I believe that it is better translation and much more fit to the character of God. He's not jealous like a jealous boyfriend, but he's zealous and trying to protect us, for he knows the consequences of when we worship other things. And he tells us the consequences right here in the commandment. He says that those that choose not to obey his commandments will suffer consequences up to 3 to 4 generations. Now let's understand what does that mean. Let's pretend a woman is pregnant and decides to use drugs. The child is born with some kind of birth defect. Was that God's will? Was that God's punishment? Or a consequence of our choices? I believe it is a consequence of our choices because he gave us the freedom to choose. But he puts a limit to those consequences, no more than 3 or 4 generations. I see this as a mercy. The third commandment says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." Now, this one is very interesting. How people make a big deal on something that is not that important and does not realize how much more serious this is. Most people think that all this commandment is saying is that we should not say, "Oh my God," or "OMG," or "Oh my gosh." Honestly, this is not that big of a deal. It's just an expression. What the commandment is actually saying is, do not use my name to take advantage of things, to oppress or hurt people. Think of how many wars happened in the name of God, the crusades, the genocides, when it was not even commanded by God. Think of church leaders that convince people to give great amounts of money to the cause of God and misuse this money. Think of that creep that takes advantage of a girl saying that it was God who told him to do it. All of these are examples of how people use the name of God in vain and how they give God a bad name by their wrong intentions. The fourth commandment says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the seas and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Here God tells us that we should take a whole 24-hour day to keep it holy. He gives us 6 days to do whatever we want. But in the seventh day, by the way, he actually identifies right here which day it is. And in this day, we should not worry about any work or how we're going to pay our bills, but we should rest in him. Trust that he is our God. He is the one who maintains us, and rest in him. The fifth says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you." Note, this is the only law that promises to prolong our lives if we follow this commandment and honor our parents. The rest is kind of self-explanatory. The sixth says, "You shall not murder." It is not saying kill, but murder. When I understood this, it made more sense to me. There is a great difference in premeditated murder and killing. Seventh, "You shall not commit adultery." 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 10th, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now that we know what is God's law, let's get into some interesting details about the law. Even though the law of God was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, it existed much before that. In Genesis 26:5 says that Abraham kept God's commandment. Abraham was much earlier than Moses. In Genesis 4:7, even earlier than Moses, says that Cain sinned when he killed his brother. And in 1 John 3:4 says that sin, what is sin, is the breaking of the law or the transgression of the law. In other words, to sin, to break the law must exist first. So the law was not created for the time of Moses, only for the Jewish people, but it always existed, and it is for all humanity. There are very distinguished differences between God's law and the ceremonial law. For an example, God's law was written by the finger of God. They were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, while the ceremonial law was written by Moses and placed outside the Ark. The ceremonial laws were never part of the Ten Commandments, and once the veil of the temple parted in two, at the death of Christ, it demonstrated that temple services with the sacrifice and all of the ceremonial laws were now obsolete. The Ten Commandments can be summarized in two parts: love God, covered by the first 4 commandments, and love for others, covered by the last 6 commandments, as we find in Matthew 22:37-40. Jesus makes it very clear in Matthew 5:17-18 that he did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but he came to fulfill it. But I know there are several parts in the letters of Paul that it seems to say the opposite, but with a little deeper study, we can clearly understand that that's not the case. Some people take Romans 7:7 to say that it is the emphasis on the law that makes people sin, because Paul says that he would not know sin if it was not for the law. But that's not what Paul is saying. Let me give an example. If I'm working in a garden and I get dirty, I get my face dirty without noticing. When I go to the bathroom and I look in the mirror, I see that I'm dirty. And now that I know, I can clean myself. It was not the mirror that made me get dirty, but it told me that I was. The same with the law. It does not make me sin, but it tells me what is sin. And now that I know, I have a choice to make, to sin or not to sin. Otherwise, I would continue sinning. In Romans 3:31, after saying beautiful things about faith, remember that Paul was talking to mostly Jewish people in Rome that were stubborn, following the law to a T, to the point of not even recognizing the giver of the law. So Paul was trying to convince them that faith supersedes the law. But he ended by saying that still faith did not void the law. Another confusing part is the topic of the Old and New Covenant. Some people believe that the 10 Commandments are no longer valid, for it is part of the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant is Christ, it's only love. They are not wrong, but love was always part of the covenant, Old and New. Even though the Old Covenant was with Abraham and his descendants, the framework for the Old Covenant is the same as for the New Covenant. That is the 10 Commandments. The New Covenant is simply the Old Covenant renewed, now with Christ and anyone who accepts Christ as their Lord and Savior. Although I do believe the 10 Commandments are God's law and valid for today and forever, I need to make something very clear. We are not saved because we keep the law. We could just be like the rich young ruler who kept all of the law, but because he did not accept Christ, there was no salvation for him. Well, at least up to the point that is registered in the Bible. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that is not of yourself. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. There is no amount of obedience or works or even good deeds that can save you. Otherwise, we would not need Christ. We could save ourselves. I obey God because I am saved, not to be saved. Now, is it realistic that someone can keep all of the law of God and be perfect through our own strength? No. But I love this verse, Philippians 2:13. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. It is God who calls you and gives you the ability to fulfill it. Don't trust in yourself, but in God, that can and will give you the strength to obey him. But what if I sin? Break one of the commandments. Go back to God. Repent. Confess your sin. Know that you are forgiven and start over. Going back to the point I was making at the beginning. Pay attention to each part of the 10 Commandments. Every single one of God's law, it's for your own protection. It's like a hedge of protection to keep us safe and happy. So obeying God is not oppressive, but it frees us from the power of sin, guilt, and shame. But how about all of the different rules that my church has? What we study today are God's laws. Much of the rest of the rules you hear in church are interpretation to God's law and other parts of the Bible. It is important to study, understand the context, and see if it's just a tradition, if it is a situational law or a cultural law, and so on. What I have learned is this: when it is from God, it builds people up in love. It's always always for our own good. It brings peace, not fear or pressure.